But now we're gonna shift into the next panel, and I'm just gonna quickly introduce it. So we often talk about transformations of the global food system as if there's one food system, but we actually have many food systems and many food cultures and many food ways, which means that we can't have one universal solution, but we need a pluriversal view of how we address problems. And we have to understand that and consider that agroecology celebrates and embraces this diversity in contrast to the homogenizing processes of racial capitalism, neocolonialism, and heteropatriarchy, and that the experience of the food system and our foodways are refracted through the prisms of culture, geography, and power, history, economy, as well as wider systems of exclusion and privilege that give benefit to some and marginalize others. So our power and our agency and ability to transform food systems also comes from these positions, while we're differentially affected by them depending on where we come from and who we are. So too is our position really important to acknowledge, celebrate, and to bring together in dialogue, which is in part what we're doing here. And we could see people in the previous panels really locating themselves and speaking from their place and their hearts, which is important. So to this end, we've invited panelists here to speak from their position and their geography and their cultures and their place, to understand how we can come together and think about food systems transformation from those various places. I want to make note that we have a pinch hitter, Charles. Unfortunately, Mamadou Goita was unable to come. He wasn't able to secure a visa and had to not join us, which is sad for us because we were really looking forward to hearing from him and having a whole week with him. But we also are very lucky to have the word of Charles, and we're going to hear from his perspective, which is wonderful. We're also really grateful for Laura Riley to be here with us as our guest moderator. Laura is the business of food reporter for the Washington Post. She's previously a food critic at the Tampa Bay Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and the Baltimore Sun. She's authored 4 books, has cooked professionally, and is a graduate of the California Culinary Academy. She's a 3-time James Beard finalist. In 2017, was a Pulitzer finalist. And it's been a pleasure working with her to put on this brilliant panel, and really happy for you all to be here. Thank you. Let's welcome Laura.
Can you hear me? Oh, good. Hey, everybody, and thanks to the previous panelists. That was awesome. Thanks to the people here and those away. And the format of this will be a little bit different. It'll be more of a conversation. And we're going to have some questions perhaps throughout, and then some questions here at the end. So just a very wee bit about me. So I started my life obsessed with food. I was small but hungry, and ended up studying culinary arts and spent a long time, decades of my life professionally, focused on what was on the plate. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I got distracted by how it got there. And so I started doing a lot more work on food systems, supply chain, food equity, and that kind of transformed my career. I kind of had that horrible imposter syndrome period where I moved from features section to business. And I only bring that up because I feel like one thing I always tell Cub reporters is you have to be willing to say when you don't understand something. And I'm not an agroecologist, and I will say that just in the past 24 hours, there's a lot of jargon and a lot of terms that I'm unfamiliar with, and so I think that I want all of us to feel empowered to raise your hand if you need a little more explication on something one of them have said, if you want them to flesh something out a little bit. If I see a show of hands, it doesn't mean you have to ask a specific question, just if you need a little richer sense of what they're talking about, I would love to facilitate that. So I'm going to allow each of the panelists to spend a couple minutes talking about their own perspective and the work that they do and where they do it. And I think I'd like to start with my friend Charles here.
Thanks very much. My name is Charles Luanga Tumuhe. I come from Uganda. I work for an organization called Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. The Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa was launched in 2011. It's a broad alliance of civil society actors, and these are part of a struggle for food sovereignty and agroecology in the African continent. These actors include food producers, networks, African civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, faith-based organizations, consumer movements, and international like-minded organizations. So AFSA is a network of networks. A network is a coalition of organizations. So our members are networks of such networks. And we are present in 50 of the 54 African countries. So we have only 4 countries to cover the entire continent. We work with a network of 40 active networks across the continent. And we envision a continent that is developed in harmony with nature, harmonizing traditional knowledge and systems, the people controlling natural resources, but also participating in decisions. So generally, our work is to facilitate the transition to agroecology for both climate action, strengthening farmer-managed seed systems, but also strengthening community voices for land rights and healthy soils, and not forgetting mobilizing citizen support for sustainable food and nutrition systems. I coordinate a project called the Healthy Soils for Healthy Food, which I'll be telling you a little more about. But for now, I must say thank you so much for having me, and I look forward for engaging with my fellow panelists in a very fruitful discussion and share my experiences about issues, food sovereignty and agroecology from the African perspective. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Jyoti, I would love to hear from you next.
My name is Jyoti Fernandez. I'm a farmer based in Dorset in the UK. And now I don't work so much as a farmer. I started my farm 20 years ago with my family, and now my family, my daughters are working on running the farm themselves now. Well, I work as an advocate. So yeah, for La Via Campesina. When I started my farm, it was very difficult for people to get into farming in the UK, and it still is, to get access to land, to the resources, to the knowledge to be able to begin to farm. And I met many other people trying to return to the land and find ways to live in harmony with the earth, to produce food for their local economy, to do the work that we need to be able to reclaim food as part of a meaningful part of our local way of being. And it was very difficult. And so in order to change that, we formed a union, which was called the Land Workers Alliance, a union for farmers, foresters, and land-based workers, because a union is a way of organizing people to collectively work to change the conditions that you live in. And so we formed a solidarity network. We work together, we laugh, we share each other's struggles, we have a lot of great parties, we come together to share knowledge and skills, but we also work politically to try and change the wider systemic issues that we face with the broken food system and the way that it's so difficult for people to get back connected to the land. And we do that as a part of La Via Campesina, which is an international network of unions all across the planet, representing 200 million peasant farmers and indigenous people, people who are very ecosystem dependent and connected on the front lines of being able to produce our food in a way that works in harmony with nature. And that union is the experience I want to bring to you here. I was at work now as an advocate to try and change agricultural policy in England, but also on an international level with my colleagues all across the world. We have organizations in 182 different countries around the world. It was formed in the 1990s as a way to fight against the globalization of the food economy, against the free trade agreements, the liberalization of all the rules that were there to protect farmers and local economies, to try and find ways to counter the narrative that it's big industrial agriculture that feeds the world and to bring that message forward. But also, like Michelle was saying in the last things, to actually form the basis of that collective action so that we can create those positive alternatives to deeply adapt to climate change, so that we can actually create a reality that is more just and equitable, more sustainable for future generations, so we work in harmony with the earth, something that's much better, you know, going forward. So I'll bring those examples from La Via Campesina and my work with people all across the UK who are really trying to live that reality of creating the new society we want to see to this panel today.
Thank you for that. Ike, we'd love to hear what you're doing here at UVM.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me out there? How about that? Is that better? Hi, everyone. My name is Ike Leslie. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an extension assistant professor of community development here at the University of Vermont. I'm a sociologist by training, so a lot of what I'll have to talk about today has to do with power relations and oppression and resistance. Most of my work, research, and also my teaching work, which is with the public, centers around bringing a food justice perspective across the food system. And my particular specialty is asking, what does gender and sexuality have to do with it? So what I'm going to be talking about today is what a queer lens brings to any of the various agroecology topics that we're going to be asked about today. So my work, like I said, spans the food system. So I started off by doing studies with queer farmers. And more lately, I've been delving into the issue of LGBTQ+ food insecurity. So audience, just because I'm curious, are there any queer farmers in the room? Oh, there's always one, but that was way more than one. Are there any queer food system workers in the room? All right, a few more. Wow, popular to be farmers. Are there any queer eaters in the room? So what I'm going to be doing today is bringing a queer theoretical lens to these topics, right? And so what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, a queer theoretical lens is for the people who just shouted out. It's for the queer people in the room to draw attention to issues that are typically swept underneath the rug. But it's also for everyone else here who didn't say something, because every person in this room, in one way or another, you got gender, you got sexuality in one way or another. It's something we all experience. Gender and sexuality are relations that each of us are enmeshed in. So a queer lens is not just about focusing on queer people in the food system, but it's also asking what does heteropatriarchy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, these ideas that we have about gender and sexuality, how does that affect all of the ways that we organize food production and distribution and consumption? A queer lens demands us to pay attention to power and the ways that heteropatriarchy intersects with other oppressions, especially racism. But it also encourages us to pay attention to resistance, right? Queer folks and oppressed folks in general aren't just passive actors bearing the brunt of these oppressive forces, but we resist in our own ways and in our own contexts. So it's particularly important to highlight those. And lastly, I'll mention that outside of my academic work, I'm a queer farmer. I live in Athens, Vermont, which is in southeastern Vermont. I own and operate a farm called Magnetic Fields Farm, which focuses on attracting and sustaining rural queer farm community. And we do that through food production, housing, land access, and events. And the one thing I'll mention about Magnetic Fields at the get-go, just to give you a little taste of what's coming, is it started out as a family farm. I started it with my now ex-husband. So just to get you thinking ahead of some of the themes we'll be talking about today. Thank you very much.
Great. And Katja, we would love to hear from you now.
Gracias, Laura. Bueno, lo primero es que I didn't realize that there was English to Spanish, but no Spanish to English. So I will maybe be shifting, and I'll try. Let me know if I switch and I don't realize it. So, primero que nada, buenas tardes a todas. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizing committee from UVM and to everyone that's doing the interpreting translation, the graduate students. You have been amazing. Thank you for the invitation. I thought about presenting myself and talking about where I got my PhD, what my research focus was. It is cultural political ecology, by the way. Recognitions, organizations, whatever. But I really want to share with you why I came here and why I said yes when Colleen says, we need a hole to be filled. And it's basically my home. At the end of the day, I want to share with you my home. And my home is the Caribbean Sea, with islands that make up less than 0.2% of the Earth's landmass. And yet, we represent more than 20% of the top 60 climate disasters over the past 2 decades. Hurricanes Irma, Maria, Eta, Iota, and Dorian all were record-breaking hurricanes within 3 years from each other that ripped through the Caribbean, marking a clear before and after in our histories and a generational milestone. Despite the devastation, at each climate conference, the chorus repeats, we need more data. We need to think of the economy. We need more time. The academics talk about adaptation and mitigation. In the Caribbean islands, we have no more time. We have been forced to face climate change with broken economies, sanctions, and austerity measures between sweltering heat, devastating floods, worsening droughts. We just had the worst drought in 500 years in 2015. Biodiversity losses and sea level rise that threatens the very corals and mangroves that protect our coasts and provide nurseries for our fisheries, amidst a crushing debt on top of everything. And we cannot even trade or talk or help each other as neighboring islands. One of the few voices to speak for islands at COP25, President Hilda Hein of the Marshall Islands summarized it best. It's a fight to the death for anyone not prepared to flee the islands. As a nation, we refuse to flee, but we also refuse to die. And who I am is this stubbornness of ours to live. This is my positionality. This is my chosen trench. My position as a system is agroecology. With agroecology, we center nature. We understand the carrying capacity of our region, not water for a food system, but water to sustain life. And through the Agroecology Institute in Puerto Rico, IALA Puerto Rico, over the past 5 years, we've been working to support farmers in their projects as keepers of knowledge, stewards of the land, and visionary scientists. We seek and redistribute resources for farmer-led movements like Boricua, and work towards access to land and right to land. We hold space for diverse agroecology schools, which include queer lenses, include access to land, and include a scientific focus for a generation that didn't have access to the university or to science. And then we seek supplementary income for all our farmers, because we all, every one of us here, owe our farmers and fisher folk, whether they have something to sell to us or not. All of this while underground doing the research to adjust the carrying capacity for our islands, connect with each other again, and documenting the agroecological transition in Puerto Rico, my home country, a colony of the US where we're still fighting for our own right to choose how we live.
Powerful. In a way, Katya was just talking about food sovereignty, and we kind of were thinking about exploring that question within the context of each of their homes. So maybe, Charles, would you like to talk a little bit about what food sovereignty means in the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks very much. You know, the concept of food sovereignty originated from the comparison with food security. Initially, we had food security, and that was to do with having access to the food all the time, you know, nutritious food for everyone and that kind of thing. But we got this story from someone who was trying to explain to us that even someone in prison is food secure but they do not have any power of where the food will come from. They do not have any idea of how this food was processed, how it was cooked, how it was transported. So only having access to food, however good it is not enough. So we believe in Africa that we must return power to the producers. We must return power to the consumers. They must be part of the decisions of how the food should be produced. The consumers must be part of the decision-making processes of how the food they're going to consume is produced, is processed. But also, we believe that there has to be fairness. If me, the producer, I am putting in a certain percentage of my effort, for example, 70% of all the effort needed to produce food is from me, the producer, why must I only earn 10% of the benefit? So it's around issues of power distribution, benefit sharing, and having control of the resources that are needed to get food on the table. So it's not just having food on the table, but it's questioning the power dynamics of the food. And as I conclude on this, I want to just give a summary. We advocate for, number one, input sovereignty. And input sovereignty is to do with who has control over the seed. And I want to say this, and I'm sure it's been said a number of times, that he who owns the seed owns the food, and he who owns the food owns your health. If a country, like for example Kenya or Zimbabwe or Uganda or Ghana or whatever, is relying on, for example, Canada or the US for their seed, they will only get that seed if there is good diplomatic relationship between the two countries. So seed is becoming a security issue. Seed is becoming a power issue. It's easy to control another country by controlling their seed. It's easy to control decisions happening in another country if you have powers over their seed. So we've seen corporations coming up, with support from their local governments, getting into the system, the agricultural trade systems in a number of African countries through the trade of seed. And that way they are capturing power of those countries. So that's number one, the seed. Number two is the fertilizer. We know our soils, as they are used a number of times, they lose their fertility, and there is a need to replenish. But where are the fertilizers coming from? If there's only one source of fertilizer, and that's the external source, this means that there's going to be no food production in a given season if there are no inflows of this fertilizer. And we saw, for example, when transportation systems broke down during the COVID period, the COVID pandemic, but also of recent during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a number of countries could not produce food anymore, or they were producing it at a very high cost. We saw production go low. We saw countries going hungry because they cannot access fertilizer and they cannot make it on their own. So what we are doing as AFSA is to help our farming communities be able to gather materials around themselves and process their own fertilizer, keep their own seed. But also, the number three is issues around the policy, the decision-making processes. So it's three things: input sovereignty, seed sovereignty, fertilizer sovereignty, and talk about the entire technology, farming technology sovereignty, but also getting access to the decision processes. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. So, Katya, I want to go back to you. You said something very hopeful at lunchtime that I'd love to hear you unpack a little bit about how the community gets fed first, and then kind of what's left gets sold to the rich people, or probably exported to the U.S. So how does that work?
I actually would like, before I get on that, which is important to me to contextualize, that the US is still imposing its policies on the rest of the world. And having a choice is not something that most of us have. I had one slide that I wanted to show you. It's after Maria, the 2017 hurricanes. And currently, the US policy towards a lot of the islands is to have renewable energies, which is all well and good, but then they're planting solar panels throughout hundreds and hundreds of acres within the already limited lands of Puerto Rico. And what's interesting is that the Caribbean itself had already been turned into an appendage of consumption for the United States. So let's see if maybe it's there. If it's not, it's okay. Oh, there it is, yay, that first slide. And the first slide on this side is an image of the solar panels after the hurricane. And you can see everything, they take away all of the topsoil to plant the solar panels. And as we all know, topsoil is really hard to replace. And right now what's going on is that that is driving farmers out directly because whoever owns the land would much rather rent it to a solar panel corporation than they would to a farmer that can afford a very low price for rent. And it's also gentrifying and displacing those around the project as land speculation goes up. So it's actually inhibiting even further our capacity to feed our communities. And the next one over I wanted to talk about because it points to something that someone already said, Georgina, thank you for mentioning it, about how we're conserving biodiversity. The European model of conservation that was imposed on all of us does not take into account that we are part of the biodiverse system that we're protecting. And if we do that, this is a US Federal Reserve. And those are the houses of rich people that were able to build there. And the reason they were able to build there is because they could buy the permits. And the fisher folk that were the ones that protected the mangrove as their nurseries were driven out. So that is the reality of US foreign policy and US, even this actually is considered domestic policy because Puerto Rico is a colony of the US. And I thought it was really interesting, something that the provost mentioned, that we need to change our diet, and that's very true. And the thing that to me gives me a lot of hope is that that happened for Puerto Rico already once. It was violent, and it happened in one generation with Operation Bootstrap. It was the industrialization of our agriculture, the industrialization of our communities, of our economy, and driving people out of the forest and the mangroves for conservation. And all of that experiment failed. And to see it now be exported, then we need more voices like Georgina. We need more voices like Blaine's to make sure, and we need the Institute for Agroecology to bring that to the forefront and make sure that it's driven that this policy didn't work and it's not going to work by spreading it worldwide.
So Jyoti, one thing you said over lunch was you were talking about changing people's diets and that it's hard to do that, that it has to come legislatively, that it can't be just kind of dietary guidelines or that kind of thing. So how in the context of the work you do, are you pushing for legislative change that obviously eventually changes people's diets?
Well, I think I'm thinking more in the context of systemic change. So it's legislative, but it's across society in lots of different ways. Partly because it's very difficult, and I see all the time in England, which has been part of a neoliberal economy for a long time, where basic human rights haven't been recognized as a responsibility for government to take forward. And a founding platform of La Via Campesina is the idea of the right to food, that governments around the world have a responsibility to provide for the right to food, so it's not just purely based on the market. That the idea that most of our basic human needs, instead of being provided by access to land or to seeds or to water or to community resources for food or through small farm economies, should actually just be governed by the market and left to the market, the same as housing and all those other sorts of things. And it's become a situation where all the food conferences, when people are talking about how we get people to have healthier diets or to promote organics or you know, a really good quality, high animal welfare food, is something that's very market-based when people have that discussion. And people say, well, we might have to educate people to pay more for their food. It's about consumer awareness. It's about having the right kind of labeling on products. And I find that argument extremely frustrating, because actually it's the responsibility of good governance and a good set of policies to be in place to allow equitable access to healthy food for all. It shouldn't just be a fancy farmer's market food that only those people that can go and afford it can be able to drive in their cars to whatever farm shop it is to be able to buy that food. Those farm shops are fantastic and they're doing their best to earn a living, but it should be that every bit of food that's available should be accessible, high animal welfare, good for the planet, and there for future generations. And that's a responsibility that we have to hold as food citizens, to hold government to account to provide for us. And whatever configuration of policies we need that support farmers to have good livelihoods, to be able to do the right forms of environmentally friendly, high animal welfare farming, to be able to make sure that rent prices and the cost of living is not in disproportion to be able to afford good food. All those things are basic human responsibilities that we have to think about wider systemic change and how we act as food citizens to demand that for everybody, rather than basing everything on consumer choice.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about access to land, because I think I've heard several of you mention that. And maybe, Ike, we can start with you in terms of how your work enables the queer community to gain access.
Well, I want to start out by thinking a little bit about how we typically access land. And I'm talking about from my own perspective here in the United States, but perhaps some of these trends are worldwide. And how farmers often access land is through the family farm. Right? And I want us to just pause for a moment and think about this family farm concept, because it's something that, very surprisingly to me in our current world, people on the right celebrate, people on the left celebrate. It's celebrated in industrial agriculture, and it's celebrated here amongst agroecology and agroecologists. But what is the family farm, right? The family farm, in my mind, it's one particular way of organizing food production that's based on the farmer's business partner also being their sexual or intimate partner. Who thought that was a good idea to produce food? Right? Like when we think about food security and how important food security is, does it really make sense to base food security on marriages when we know what divorce rates look like? You know, it's funny, but these are the sort of hidden in plain sight things that a queer theoretical lens brings. It says, what are the ways that everyone out there is using these gender and sexual norms of organizing our very basic necessities in life? I also want to briefly bring us back to the history of the family farm, at least in the United States. So there's a fabulous historian and queer theorist named Gabriel Rosenberg at Duke University, who documents the history of the family farm and talks about it as a project of the settler colonial state. Why was the US government at the time interested in promoting family agriculture? Well, in westward expansion, it was a way of seizing indigenous lands and maintaining those lands intergenerationally in white ownership. Many of those families, 5, 6 generations in or whatever, are the same families that me and my colleagues in Extension interact with, who say they've been on this land for that many generations. Now, the government used the family farm as a tool of holding and maintaining land, but it also, about 100 years ago, was very cognizant about what gender and sexuality had to do with farm life. So the United States Department of Agriculture, for example, this is one of the examples that Dr. Rosenberg gives us, the USDA started this program called 4-H, which is another beloved program in where I work at UVM Extension. And 4-H is a youth program. And the government started 4-H, Rosenberg tells us, for two reasons. One is because it was really difficult to convince farmers to start spraying toxic chemicals on their land and adopt industrial agricultural practices. Like, that was not an inevitability. The government needed to push it. And they thought, well, teaching children is a really good way to do that because they're gonna grow up and being the next generation of farmers, and adult farmers are a little harder to, it's harder to change their minds. The other driving factor here was that the US government was concerned, and I'm talking in the 1920s or so, about a declining rural white birth rate. So these 4-H classes, they weren't just about agriculture. They had courtship dances, right? They were about teaching young people about how to be heterosexual, about how to be monogamous, about how, as a man, to be a farmer as a business person, and how, as a woman, your place is not in the field, but your place is in the home, specifically as a home consumer. Women especially were really difficult to convince to stop being farmers. I mean, still around the world, most farmers are women. And much of the numbers that we use today, like with the USDA Ag Census, which only started including gender as an option in 1978, continue to totally undercount women for many different reasons, including that lots of the types of agriculture that women do, like poultry or growing for self-sufficiency and things like that, might not be considered as what it means to be a farmer. So back to this question of land access. So my research is about farm viability, but I'm not an economist. I'm a sociologist. And my approach to studying farm viability highlights 7 key areas that are really important to make a farm economically viable: land, labor, credit, knowledge, health or healthcare, housing, and markets. Land there being number 1. And my research shows that when we organize access to these key resources for farm viability through intimate partnerships, through the family farm, when we organize health access through the family farm, when we organize land access through the family farm, et cetera, it tends to breed certain inequalities. For example, amongst the queer farmers that I work with and have done research with, some of them use this family farm model. I started out that way because it was the only way I could economically swing it. And then my marriage crashed and burned. And with that, my farm crashed and burned. And this is something about the family farm model I want to say. It doesn't just hurt queer folks where the family farm does not fit our chosen way of doing family and of doing farming, but it can also really hurt the economic viability of single people, no matter who you are, interested in farming, but also of coupled, cisgender, heterosexual people. Because in my case, when something goes wrong on the farm, it can really affect the personal relationship, and when something in the personal relationship goes wrong, it can really affect the farm. So, I mean, I could talk about this stuff forever, so I'll stop. But I'll just wrap up on saying this idea of the family farm and the way we're organizing land access, I think from a queer perspective, points to some alternative ways of doing that, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about later, but I'll just center us in thinking ahead about what does this idea of the chosen family farm mean.
Can I kind of step in? So I have another image that I wanted to share with you guys. And that image, I don't know how that works, but maybe. Thank you, Marta. And that is what you see there. Those are the shoes of all of us. It was an art exhibit that was done in front of the Capitol in Puerto Rico after Maria. All the shoes of everyone that we lost due to the hurricane. Each one of us that had someone that lost someone took our shoes there and had that exhibit. And thanks to ELDA and the Alliance for Women in Agroecology, in 2018, we were able, a group of us, including Carol Ramos, Analisa Perez, AIXA, were able to go to Chiapas and visit for the encounter of women in agroecology, activist women who fight and who struggle in the world. And I saw this mural that I fell in love with that said, al mal sistema capitalista le decimos, oh no, it's not there. Pooh. So I will read it to you. Let's see if I can find it here. Pero al mal sistema capitalista le decimos, nuestros sueños no caben en sus urnas, tampoco nuestras pesadillas y tampoco nuestros muertos. To the broken capitalist economic system we say, our dreams do not fit in your ballots. Neither do our nightmares, and certainly not our dead. And those are our dead from Maria. And one of the things that we're doing as part of choosing life is based on what Ike was saying about changing the way that we look and structure our farms and our projects. So we looked at having agroecology schools, and we sustain 3 agroecology schools, one with a queer perspective, like I mentioned, one with a scientific perspective, and one that's focused on rural needs. For example, if literacy or basket weaving is the need, that agroecology school focuses on that. So right after Hurricane Fiona last year, we focused on health. We had a lot of scares, farmers ready to commit suicide or farmers ready to get rid out of farming or out of Puerto Rico. So part of that process was, well, the agroecology school is fine, but then they're faced with, if you're not married, if you're not in an X type of relationship, you cannot access land. If you're not inheriting it, you cannot access land. So one of the things that we are working on is specifically a land access campaign that focuses on bringing about different ways of land tenure. And it starts breaking the fact that the land title is what makes you a person or makes you visible in front of the state. And it starts giving a name to each project, a name to each farm, and providing access to that land. And what's beautiful about the project is that each one of those farms that's being anchored is a community work center. And as a community work center, it breaks from the pattern of that heteropatriarchal family that's supported. And those connections are what Laura was talking about that I mentioned at lunch, which is precisely the community eats first. What's left over, we sell to the market, and we sell to the market to those that can afford. And then we redistribute the ganancias, the earnings, the income, yes. So that is also a very strong part of not only anchoring the projects in a space and having that access to land, making sure that we get the resources. So raise the funds to buy the land and make it a collective land tenure type of system. And then on top of that, making sure that we're eating first. And Nelson Alvarez actually summarized it very well. And I loved the people mentioned about changing the food system or how food production is done. And the thing is that the way that our ancestors did it was, he calls it, we planted in thirds. So it was 1/3 for the family, 1/3 for market, and 1/3 for the pests. So 1/3 would be food waste. And that's actually, even with all the industrialization and all the petroleum we're putting in, we're still having 1/3 of food waste. But when we did it for the pests, we were able to then shift and work with the local biodiversity and do the different routines, like cycles of planting. So to us, having land access and stopping the land speculation that's going on due to the corporations is a way to choose life, and it's a way to avoid this. And it's our way to say that no matter what we do, we always have to keep in mind those voices that are no longer here.
So Mamadou, who Charles graciously took the place of today, was talking about the significant problem of land grabs in Mali. So I'd love to hear from Charles about land access and kind of ways to push back against that in the U.S. We've had this, generations of the Pigford trials and the horrible outcome of those, and then even in the current administration, there's very feeble and perhaps misguided attempts to forgive debt for black farmers in the U.S., and it's a complicated question, but how is it where you are?
Yeah, thanks very much. Land, I would say, is the most important factor of production. I mean, you cannot farm in the air. Yeah, well, maybe with some technology, but for now in Africa, it's not possible. We are farming on the land, so as we advance the agroecology, the farming agenda, the first question is, where are we going to do this from? So as AFSA, we've been doing a lot of pushback on land grabs, through 2 projects, Women and Land Rights Project in West Africa and Central Africa, but also the Our Land is Our Life project. So for those 2 projects, we've been fighting for the Maasai people in Tanzania. And what's happening in Tanzania, in the Ngorongoro area, there is a company working with the government. I mean, they have lots of government support, and they are saying, please leave this land. We want to use this land for conservation. But this is indigenous land for the Maasai people, for the indigenous community of the Maasai, and they do not have where to go. So we are giving them all the support. We are talking to different actors, different partners, putting out papers, newsletters, articles, going to all sorts of media to campaign, to defend for the Maasai people, so they will be able to retain the land. Yeah. So in other parts of Africa, we are working around inclusive governance structures. Dating back to the colonial histories, we have colonial land laws, colonial land policies that were imported to us that are very unfair. I'll just give you an example. The land title system is pushing so many people out of their lands. Initially, we had our customary land governance system, where land was in charge of the chiefs, the local chiefs, the cultural leaders. Land was communally owned. I mean, everyone had access to the land. Everyone in the community had opportunity to utilize the land. Control was shared. But with the land title system, the control has been shifted to the rich, the elite guys who go to the local authorities, bribe the local authorities, and process what they call land titles. But we found out many of these land titles are fraudulently processed. And we've seen a number of evictions. So we are advocating in Africa for an inclusive governance system where the local people, the indigenous communities, should be given back the powers to decide on how land should be accessed, on how land should be utilized, on how land should be controlled. So that's the other thing we are doing. But also, as I plan to conclude, we are fighting for the other vulnerable groups, not only the indigenous communities in Maasai, Tanzania, but also the women. There's, again, a historical problem in Africa. Women in many families are not part of the inheritance circles. It's usually the male child who becomes the heir, who inherits the family property, who inherits the land. But also looking at the economic status of a woman in Africa, it's lower than the male counterpart. So it's even difficult for them to buy the land. So we are having a project in 5 countries, African countries, working with women. This project is driven by women, and it's helping them, come together, generate ideas, draft policy position papers, and present these position papers to government authorities, to the African Union. We have a very strong working relationship with the African Union, with the Pan-African Parliament, and they are starting to listen to us. We are also working to defend the youth. I am a youth, I am a young person. In Africa, below 35, you're a young person, you're a youth, and I am in that category. But with the difficulties of accessing incomes, it's very difficult, to get hold of land. And we are the majority there in Africa. We are very energetic, we have a lot of energy. I mean, we should be doing a lot in agriculture and agroecology, but accessing land is very, very difficult. So we are also having a lot of work we are doing to enable the young people like myself access land so they can practice agriculture, agroecology. You can never take care of land that you do not have powers on. You can only conserve the land that you have powers on. So if you have threats of eviction, you will never conserve any biodiversity on a piece of land that you think someone is going to push you out the next day. But again, after sorting all issues of access, how do we equitably, how do we sustainably utilize the land? So we are having a project called the Healthy Soil, Healthy Food Project, which is advancing sustainable land management practices. Because land is very scarce, it's difficult to access land, but once you have had it, how do you use it? Are you going to kill every life in there with chemicals, for example? We are saying no, that doesn't work. We have lands that have lost, for example, the microbiodiversity. So we are working to return the microbiodiversity back to the land through assisting farmers, manufacture these materials at farm level, but also advancing farming practices that are very nature friendly. Thanks very much.
So I'd like to open it up for questions in a couple minutes, but I'd love each of the panelists to maybe take 2 minutes and talk about something that they're hopeful or optimistic about. And Jyoti, maybe we'll start with you.
I feel a huge amount of hope that we'll be able to reorder society into something that's so much more exciting than ever before in history. But every single day that's founded on feeling a lot of anger, a lot of pain, a lot of heartbreak. From working, I really work in a lot of spaces where we're trying to get the messages through. I see beautiful things all over the world. My job takes me to the most special ecosystems. I've done solidarity work with the indigenous in the middle of the Amazon and sat in 12 million hectares of land in a circle of the most beautiful houses, dancing with the indigenous people there, and feeling the vibrancy of life at such a frequency that we can hardly experience within modern society. When the insects and the humans and the fact that there's no electricity surrounding you is at such a high frequency. There's a life there, force that is so powerful. It moves the very depths of your soul and your spirit. And when you look at communities working together to fight things, I went and visited the Korean Farmers Union, who is having a gathering of trade unions around the planet to try and think about just transition plans for our future in whatever sector they were in. There were oil and gas workers from Nigeria, people that were working on the Volvo automotive lines in Sweden, there as Via Campesina representing just transition in the farming sector and what we do. And they were all coming together with well-costed plans, with like-for-like, jobs within the industry, putting a price tag and a vision ahead of where we can go to have a sustainable planet that actually provides for all of us in an equitable fashion. When I sit with young people around a fire, we have this festival, the Land Skills Fair, you know, where we bring young people together that want access to land and have jobs that have meaning in their lives. And they sit around the fire all night, sometimes till the dawn, singing song after song after song, not a phone in sight, nothing having to do with having to buy this or that for human happiness. They're just connecting with that real heart spirit. And you just listen to them and you see their faces in the fire and you know that there's absolute hope that if we come together, it's like, you know, the kindest movement in history to transform things and really feel that power inside ourselves. We have the possibility to create something so special, you know, special family units, special ways of organizing ourselves, ways of transforming our spirit and our relationship to nature. All of this is totally possible, and I see it on almost every human being I encounter in some way, that they're moving past the heartbreak, they're moving past all the things that hold us back to create something different. And if we can join those together, I know we have the possibility to transform ourselves to the next level of reality that's beyond anything we've ever imagined. But we have to overcome those obstacles, and we have to work collectively, and we have to work with complete unification and power, and we will do it.
I hate to ask you to follow that, but I'm asking you to follow that.
We're a team up here, it's okay. So there are 3 examples of super queer things that I see hope in that I wanted to share with you. The first I alluded to already, which is chosen family farms rather than blood family farms. And what I want to draw attention to here is in blood family, you don't have much of an opportunity to consent to who you're in relationship with. And chosen family, it's all about ongoing consent, right? Which for that reason, by the way, necessarily makes it a feminist project, and that should be named and centered. When I speak and work with queer farmers, I see many more diverse examples of how queer farmers choose to organize their families and their farms. Part of a queer perspective, which, if I'm not already out there, might put me out there a little further, is questioning what monogamy has to do with it. And I ask you all to think, is monogamy the monoculture of the farm household? So chosen family farms mean that there isn't this sort of heteropatriarchal blueprint for organizing family and farm life, and so sometimes chosen family with a focus on consent can bring us to more cooperative forms of farm organization. The second idea I wanted to share is queer food supply chains. So we don't talk about it very often, but queer folks are disadvantaged at every point of the food supply chain, right? So I just got some numbers here from a recent study I did in New England and found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual New Englanders are twice as likely as heterosexual New Englanders to experience food insufficiency, which is an even more extreme measure of food insecurity than we typically use. Now, transgender New Englanders are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience food insufficiency than cisgender New Englanders. And all of these numbers are compounded by systemic racism in such a way where about 1 in 3 Black transgender people in New England are experiencing food insufficiency right now, which means they didn't have enough to eat just this last week. So that's an undercount, right? Because if you had enough money to eat a month ago but not last week, you wouldn't even be counted in these numbers. So back to the idea of queer food supply chains, there are queer farmers and queer folks in the food systems who are starting to take this idea of queer food sovereignty into their own hands. So one example of that I love is Rocksteady Farm in Millerton, New York, which is a queer farmer cooperative and organizes queer food supply chains to New York City. They have a sliding scale CSA system so that the majority of their CSA recipients at this point are low income, and they deliver to queer health organizations as well. And the last thing I want to say is focus on transnational queer farmer organizing. I think it's really important to center that this whole queer farmer thing is like not a US thing. It's not a white thing. It's emerging all around the world. And in these different organizing spaces that I've observed, there's like just a couple things that are like super queer and I think really good for us to think about. And the first of those is bodily sovereignty. What does it mean to have bodily sovereignty, especially as a farmer, which in my mind includes farm workers? Bodily sovereignty demands labor justice, which is necessarily an anti-capitalist view of the world. Chosen family, which I've talked about, it embodies this feminist focus on consent and labor and also household relations, but also a decolonial or anti-colonial focus on land access and ownership. And lastly, queer joy, right? So us queer folks, look, we've always been good at like using celebration and sex and fabulousness in our organizing strategies, which I think is really important when we think about crises like the farmer mental health crisis and what it means to sustain collective action. Thanks.
Charles, I think I want to go back to you and tell us about your fabulousness. What are you excited about?
Thanks a lot. Despite the many challenges and issues that we have discussed today, I see a lot of resilience. I see a lot of innovation in Africa. Communities are very energetic, have a lot of optimism. And I'm very much excited about the growth of the agroecology gospel in Africa. And this gospel is a huge promise to building sustainable food systems. For us, as the Alliance of Food Sovereignty, we believe that if food systems must be transformed, not only in the African continent, but globally, we need to invest in research. We've got to develop our own African solutions. We've got to develop our own local context solutions through research, farmer-led research. The farmer is the researcher, is the data collector, he is the disseminator of the research, and is the consumer of the research, as opposed to the conventional way of doing research, where someone comes from the research organization or from the university with a data collection tool, extract information, and run away with it, and they never come back to the community, publish a paper, put online, and the farmers don't even have smartphones. So we are looking at a kind of research that is empowering the local farming communities, that is culminating into the development, but at the same time, dissemination of farming technologies within the local farming landscapes. Number two, as the Alliance for Food Sovereignty, we believe in raising awareness for the consumers, you, the eaters, because if you do not know, you will continue demanding for the wrong things. If we make you aware, if we alert you, you will demand for the right food. You will demand for healthy food. And before you know it, the unhealthy food, the bad food, what you actually call good food, will lack market. No one will be buying it, and that will be the end of the story. So we are doing a lot of work to develop messages, to develop communication materials, but also to improve the marketing infrastructure. Because after making you aware, there has to be a market facility where you will go and find this good food, where you will go and find this good farm input for your kitchen garden, for your home garden. That's number two. But number three, we believe that food system transformation will happen if we all come together, if we build a movement, a strong movement. The Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa is a movement of 40 networks, like I said before, and we are still recruiting more. So the whole of Africa is going to be one, in one establishment. And we are going to have a very loud voice, and we will resist any kind of wrong narratives. So I want to invite the US, I want to invite other parts of the world to embrace movement building, to embrace networking, to embrace collaboration, to embrace partnership. That's one way we can have collective capacity. That's one way we can have synergy, work together and resist anything we believe is against our health, is against our well-being, is against humanity. You know, we've seen a number of selfish ambitions. You know, companies coming to extract profit in the name of helping us, in the name of selling us farm inputs, in the name of selling us food. But this is poison. This is killing us. It's reducing our life dependency. So movement building is a very strong approach we are looking at, and we are promoting as the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. And lastly, it's about policy advocacy. We are working to create an enabling environment, because we can say all this, but if there is no favorable regulation, if there are no favorable policies, there's going to be no space, there's going to be no environment where these very nice proposals will be implemented. So we are doing that through establishment of multi-stakeholder platforms. Almost in all countries where we are working, we are mobilizing policy actors to come together, and we are agreeing on food system, environmental friendly policies, agroecology-oriented policies. And through this, we believe we are going to influence funding models, because that's the other challenge that's affecting the transformation of food systems in Africa. We have funding models that are oriented the wrong way. The monies are going to the wrong side. So we want to redirect the funding models. Money should be brought to the right side. Money should be brought to the healthy food systems. So through our policy work, that is of course informed by research, that is supported by our movement, that is supported by our campaigns we do, we believe we are going to have a transformed Africa. We are going to have a transformed continent. We are going to live in a healthy world where everyone is happy, everyone is thriving. Thanks very much.
So we're going to finish this session out with Katya's thoughts, but I encourage all of you to hunt these guys down during the what I hear is apple cider donuts. Someone said that. If you do have questions, we just don't have quite time for that this afternoon, so you know what they look like. Go find them. So Katya, tell us your thoughts.
Oh boy, Lord forbid being between me, us and food, but so I have one more slide, and that's the last one that I wanted to finish. I have two things that bring me joy and happiness in life. This is one of them. The second one I'm going to leave for right before the break. And these are, as you can see, multi-generations of farmers that were doing a brigade right after Maria. And Bandana Shiva talked about how nature's currency is life. It's life itself. So what gets me excited is thinking about creating intergenerational communities, about thriving life, not just surviving. So we can survive, but how are we going to survive? And that survival requires, beyond just mere reproduction, requires strategies, moving us beyond tactics, reactions, and just mere survival. And institutions like the Institute for Agroecology here are critical to help us build those different strategies and those different angles. And the coolest thing about that is that it helps us not only reclaim agriculture for future generations, but it helps us also reinvent, recreate the cultural heritage for Puerto Rico and so many other colonies that was stripped away from us. So that is only done from the bottom up, from the very land and soil itself, the sea itself, and with international support. And there is a role for people in the US to push, to stop this policy, to stop the sanctions in Zimbabwe, for example, to have multiple strategies and to understand that we're gonna be moving, some of us with the institutions, some of us without the institutions, and some of us even against some institutions. And all of those strategies are super necessary. And lastly, I just want to thank Colin and Ernesto for taking the bet on inviting me for this thing. And recognizing that this work takes time, it takes consistency, a lot of consistency, a lot of discipline, like our friend Saulo Araujo says, disciplina, disciplina, disciplina. And thinking about having courage and even the luxury to fall, fail, and try again, over and over again. We have, as a culture, to embrace fear and change as a necessary part of life. And to truly believe, each one of us, in our core, in our hearts, that we deserve and that we can have something so much better than what we were dealt. And that the next time that we face a crisis, like Hurricanes Maria and Dorian, Eta and Iota, it will be on our terms and not on our knees. So thank you.
So thank you to all the
All right.
panelists. And I
So-
think Colin is going to release us to donuts now.
Wait, hold on. Before the release, I want to gift you with my second favorite thing in the whole world. I'm going to ask Blaine and Niels and all of the Caribbean people that are here, Gabriela, venga, que me ayuden con la clave, por favor. Y Colin, por favor, a ver si sale, a ver si nos sale, viene. Ah, claro. ¿Cómo no vamos a acabar una canción, un panel con la vía? A ver, ¿suena? Let's see, maybe. Sorry, I got you all excited. Ajá. Ah, era el clip.